In a museum collection, connected to a site in the Nile Valley, in what is now northern Sudan, sits a set of human remains, roughly 13,400 years old. Lodged in the ribcage is a stone projectile point, not simply resting near the bone, but embedded directly into it, driven in with enough force to leave a permanent mark. And here's the detail that makes this genuinely unsettling. The bone around that wound shows signs of healing. This person survived that first injury. They recovered, kept. Somebody attacked this individual, they survived, and then somebody, possibly the same people, possibly someone else, came back and finished the job. There was no nation involved, no army, no declared conflict, no flag. Just one group of humans deciding that another human needed to die. More than 13,000 years ago. So did humans. Did we invent war? Or has some version of this always been part of who we are? That question has occupied archaeologists, anthropologists, and historians for generations, and the honest answer depends heavily on what exactly we mean by the word war. If we mean organized standing armies, with supply lines and a chain of command, that has an identifiable starting point somewhere in the historical record. But if we mean coordinated, deliberate violence between one group of humans and another, the trail stretches back so far that it starts to blur into the much bigger question of what it even means to be human. Let's start with the bones, because the bones don't lie about what happened, even if they can't tell us exactly why. That skeleton comes from a site called Jebel Sahaba, sometimes referred to as Cemetery 117, excavated in the 1960s during work connected to the Aswan Dam. Archaeologists there uncovered dozens of burials dating to roughly 13,400 years ago, and for decades, the site was treated as the earliest known evidence of organized warfare, essentially a prehistoric massacre frozen in the ground. But in 2021, a re-examination of the remains using modern microscopic analysis, led by researcher Isabelle Crevecoeur, the team identified far more injuries than previous studies had documented, and critically, many individuals,
women and children alike. This didn't look like a single battle. It looked like chronic, recurring violence, raids
and retaliations stretching across years, possibly generations, likely connected to the severe environmental instability affecting the Nile Valley at the end of the last ice age. As water levels and available resources became increasingly unpredictable, sit with what that actually means. Over 13,000 years ago, with no agriculture, no cities, no written law of any kind, small groups of hunter-gatherers living along a river were engaged in sustained, repeated, lethal violence against other groups of humans. Not a single outburst, a pattern. Jebel Sahaba isn't an isolated case either. Near Lake Turkana in northern
Kenya, a site called Nataruk, excavated by a team led by Marta Mirazon Lar and published in 2016, revealed the
remains of at least 27 individuals, dating to roughly 10,000 years ago, left unburied, at the edge of what was once a lagoon. Several skeletons showed unmistakable signs of violent death, crushed skulls, broken limbs, and an obsidian blade still lodged in one man's skull, and what may have been bindings on the wrists of one of the women.
This matters enormously because these weren't farmers defending stored grain or a fixed settlement. They were nomadic hunter-gatherers, people who owned little more than what they could physically carry. For a long time, the leading explanation for the origin of organized violence pointed squarely at agriculture, the idea that once people had property worth defending, they had a reason to fight. Nataruk challenges that explanation directly, because these people had nothing to defend in that sense, and someone
killed them anyway. Why remains genuinely unclear. It may have been about access to resources in an unusually fertile stretch of land. Some researchers have pointed to the demographics of the dead. Adults of both sexes present, but a notable absence of young adult women among the remains, as possible evidence that women may have been taken rather than killed. Others caution that we may simply be unable to fully reconstruct the motive from bones alone. Before going further into the human record, it's worth stepping outside it entirely, Because the question of whether humans invented this,
Behavior or inherited? It has a real test case, and it comes from our closest living relatives. In the 1970s, primatologist Jane Goodall was studying a community of chimpanzees at Gombe Stream National Park in Tanzania that she had followed for over a decade. During this period, the
community split into two smaller groups, occupying different parts of the same territory. Over the following several years, males from one group carried out a series of coordinated, lethal attacks against males from the other, systematically hunting down and killing them one at a time until the smaller group had effectively ceased to exist, with the surviving group expanding into the vacated territory. Goodall later described the experience as genuinely devastating.
having spent years documenting the emotional and social complexity of these same animals. This matters because chimpanzees
Are our closest living relatives, sharing the overwhelming majority of our DNA, with a common ancestor stretching back several million years. If chimpanzees are capable of organized, lethal, territorial violence against members of their own species, and the evidence from Gombe suggests clearly that they are, then the underlying capacity for this kind of behavior may predate the human lineage entirely. We may not have invented this. We may have inherited it. But that conclusion is
genuinely contested among researchers, and the debate has run for decades. On one side sits what's often called the deep roots
view, the idea that lethal group violence is an evolved behavior with a long biological history. Archaeologist Lawrence Keeley argued forcefully for this position in his influential 1996 work, compiling archaeological and ethnographic
Evidence suggesting that violent death was strikingly common in many pre-state societies, in some cases affecting a finmijumals
substantial proportion of adult males, far higher, proportionally, than modern warfare's toll on most contemporary populations. Writer and researcher Steven Pinker later built on this data to argue that human societies have actually become dramatically less violent over time, crediting organized states with reducing overall violence, despite their capacity to wage large-scale war. On the other side sits anthropologist R. Brian Ferguson, along with researchers Douglas Fry and Patrick Soderberg, who published a widely discussed study in 2013 examining lethal violence across a broad sample of mobile forager societies, the kind of small, nomadic groups believed to most closely resemble how humans lived for the overwhelming majority of our
history. Their findings suggested that most lethal violence in these societies was personal, individual disputes, and
revenge, jealousy, rather than organized conflict between groups. Ferguson has argued that war specifically, as opposed
to individual violence, requires social organization, a defined group identity, and the deliberate dehumanization of an
enemy, and that these elements are learned and culturally constructed rather than simply innate. So who's correct?
The evidence genuinely suggests something more layered than either side alone. The underlying capacity for coordinated violence does appear to be very old, visible in chimpanzees, visible in the bones from Jebel Sahaba and Nataruk. But capacity isn't the same thing as war itself. War, in any meaningful organized sense, requires infrastructure, leadership, planning, and a sustained shared motive, not simply the ability to become violent. And that infrastructure appears to have been built gradually, over a very long period of time, in response to specific and identifiable historical pressures. The most important of those pressures may have been surprisingly simple. Having something worth fighting over that couldn't simply be walked away from. For most of human history, mobility itself acted as a kind of pressure valve. If a neighboring group turned hostile, the option to relocate to a different territory still generally existed. Conflict clearly still happened. Nataruk demonstrates that plainly. But it wasn't necessarily self-sustaining, in the way later warfare would become. That changed with the rise of agriculture. Beginning roughly 12,000 years ago, in what's generally called the Neolithic
Revolution, communities in several parts of the world began deliberately cultivating plants and domesticating animals, settling
permanently and storing surplus food, creating something genuinely new in human experience: immovable wealth.
A stored grain surplus cannot simply be picked up and carried away. Neither can a cleared and planted field representing. The archaeological record reflects this shift fairly directly. Fortified settlements begin appearing within a few thousand years of agriculture's spread. The walls of Jericho, often cited as among the earliest known fortifications and dated to roughly 8,000 BCE, have been the subject of real scholarly debate, with some researchers arguing they may have originally served flood control purposes rather than defense. But by around 6,000 BCE, unmistakably defensive architecture, ditches, palisades, and watchtowers begins appearing more broadly across the Near East and into parts of Europe. Not every early settlement relied on walls, though. Çatalhöyük, one of the largest known early settlements in what is now Turkey, had essentially no perimeter walls or gates at all. Instead, its houses were built tightly against one another, entered only through rooftop openings via ladders, presenting any outside attacker with a largely blank, difficult-to-scale exterior. Skeletal evidence from the site suggests remarkably low levels of violent trauma. Whatever approach the community had taken toward security, it appears to have worked reasonably well. And yet the very fact that a community would design its architecture this way around the threat of attack tells us something important in itself. That the threat was real enough to plan an entire settlement around avoiding it. From here, something else changes the equation entirely: hierarchy. The emergence of chiefs, kings, and centralized authority capable of organizing labor and directing violence at a scale no small hunter-gatherer band ever could. In Mesopotamia, by around 3000 BCE, early city-states including Uruk, Lagash were competing directly for control of fertile land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, and doing so with organized military forces. A carved monument, known as the Stele of the Vultures, dated to roughly 2450 BCE and associated with a ruler of Lagash, depicts soldiers advancing in tight formation, shields interlocked, spears leveled, widely regarded as among the earliest
known depictions of coordinated infantry tactics. It's also, quite explicitly, a monument celebrating military victory.
Evidence that by this point, organized warfare wasn't simply happening, it was being commemorated.
Roughly 2 centuries later, a further shift occurred with Sargon of Akkad, traditionally credited with building one
of history's earliest professional standing armies. Soldiers maintained and supported year-round by the state, rather than farmers called up seasonally and sent home after a campaign. A permanent, professional force meant the ability to campaign in any season, project power across considerable distances, and hold conquered territory indefinitely, capabilities that helped Sargon establish what's generally regarded as the first true territorial empire in Mesopotamian history. This represents something genuinely significant. A shift from warfare as an occasional, reactive event toward warfare as a deliberate, ongoing instrument of policy. Centuries later still, in 1457 BCE, Egyptian pharaoh Thutmose III led a campaign against a coalition of Canaanite forces near the fortress city of Megiddo, a campaign recorded in considerable administrative and tactical detail by contemporary scribes on temple walls at Karnak. The Battle of Megiddo is often cited as the earliest battle in history documented with this level of reliable, contemporary written detail, marking the point where the story of war shifts from something inferred through bones and monuments to something we can read directly, in the words of the people who organized and fought it.
Alongside all of this, the weapons themselves changed in a way that says something about how deeply organized violence
had become embedded in these societies. For most of human history, weapons were repurposed tools, a spear built for hunting, a bow built for hunting, capable of killing a person, but not specifically designed for that purpose alone. Archaeologists point to the mace, a heavy, shaped stone head, mounted on a wooden handle, as among the earliest objects that appears to have been designed specifically and exclusively for killing another human being, useless for hunting, farming, or any other practical task.
Mace heads begin appearing in the archaeological record of the Near East roughly 8 to 10,000
years ago, and over time, the object shifted from simple weapon to powerful symbol. The Narmer palette, an Egyptian artifact dated to around 3100 BCE, depicts an early Egyptian king raising a mace over a kneeling captive, one of the earliest surviving images of centralized political authority, and the symbol chosen to represent that authority
was a weapon built specifically for killing. Further evidence of organized combat appears in an entirely different medium, rock art found across parts
of eastern Spain, generally dated to the Mesolithic and early Neolithic periods, depicts groups of armed human figures confronting other groups of armed figures in what appear to be deliberate battle scenes, rather than hunting or ritual imagery, among the earliest known visual depictions of coordinated conflict found anywhere. And physical evidence of large-scale conflict continued to surface much later than most historians once expected. Along the Tollensee River in northern Germany, archaeological excavation beginning in the 2000s uncovered what's now considered the oldest known battlefield in Europe, and the remains of at least 150 individuals scattered along several kilometers of riverbank, alongside bronze and flint weapons, dated to roughly 1250 BCE, during the Bronze Age. Researchers estimate that thousands of combatants may have been, and isotopic analysis of the remains suggests that some individuals traveled from considerable distances to take part. Evidence of an organized, interregional conflict that significantly revised earlier assumptions about
how peaceful Bronze Age Northern Europe actually was. A very different kind of evidence emerged much
later and half a world away. At a site called Crow Creek, along the Missouri River in South Dakota, archaeologists in the 1970s uncovered a mass grave containing the remains of several hundred individuals, men, women, and children,
showing widespread evidence of violent death. Dated to roughly the 14th century CE and likely connected to resource competition
during a period of prolonged drought. This wasn't evidence of two armies meeting in open battle. It appeared to be. These discoveries represent the near total destruction of an entire community. There's one more piece of this puzzle worth sitting with. Because the physical evidence, the bones, the weapons, the fortifications, tells us clearly what happened, without fully explaining how it was psychologically possible. Humans are, by most measures, deeply social, empathetic. Animals are capable of forming strong bonds even with strangers. So how did groups of people convince themselves to systematically kill other humans who were, in every meaningful sense, essentially identical to them? Much of the answer appears to come down to a psychological pattern researchers refer to as in-group and out-group distinction, something observed across virtually every human society ever studied, from small hunter-gatherer bands to modern nation-states. It takes remarkably little, a different language, a different appearance, a different territory, to trigger a sense that another group falls outside one's own circle of moral consideration. And once that line is drawn, the ordinary instincts towards empathy and cooperation that typically govern human behavior can be selectively suspended toward whoever falls on the other side of it. This doesn't appear to be a recent cultural invention. It looks like a deeply rooted feature of human psychology, and without them, organized warfare as we understand it would likely have been impossible to sustain. In many respects, building better weapons was never really the hardest part of war. Convincing people to use them against other humans was. So where does all of this actually leave the original question? Humans probably didn't invent war in the way someone invents a single tool at one moment, in one place, for one clear purpose. It appears to have emerged gradually across thousands of years. Through a series of escalating developments, the underlying capacity for coordinated violence appears to be genuinely ancient, visible in chimpanzees, visible in remains over 13,000 years old. But that capacity alone isn't war. War, in a fuller sense, required infrastructure, organization, leadership, and a sustained motive, elements that appear to have been assembled gradually, piece by piece, largely over the last 12,000 years.
Agriculture created wealth worth defending. Settlement created territory worth defending. Hierarchy created the leadership capable of organizing large-scale violence, and purpose-built weapons and standing armies turned an occasional, reactive conflict into something that could be planned, sustained, and repeated almost indefinitely. The idea that war is a species that likely carried the underlying capacity for organized violence for a very long time, and that this only built the full apparatus of war once the right conditions, permanence, surplus, hierarchy, and purpose-built weapons finally came together. And once they did, war proved to be one of the most persistent and enduring inventions our current species has ever produced. One whose basic logic, that someone has something another group wants, and that the distance between those two facts can be closed through organized violence, has remained. Recognizable across more than
13,000 years of human history,